Last spring, in the Golden Years, one of our Golden Years sessions, we looked at little-known facts about Arkansas. And the idea came to me from a movie that my wife watched on TV. How many of you women recognize the three ladies up here on the screen? Raise your hand. Go ahead and raise them up. How many of you men recognize the three ladies? That's what I thought. This was a Hallmark movie. And I was watching it. In fact, I like realistic Hallmark movies. It may not be too macho, but I do. This was a movie called The Magic of Ordinary Days. And in this movie, there was a scene that got my attention. The three ladies were in an old truck. This was back in World War II days, the 40s. And they were traveling through central part of the United States, and they came to a stop as German prisoners were walked across in front of the truck. And enjoying history, I looked at that and I thought, I don't believe that's really real. They must have just interjected that into the movie to make it interesting or plot. So after the movie, I decided I was going to research a little bit about POWs on American soil. And I found out that there were a lot of German, Italian, and a few Japanese prisoners on American soil. And I want to show you a few slides here, a little bit of history before we get into, and I wanted to use it to introduce our thought tonight. Okay. It would help if I turn it on. It's on? Okay. This is an actual scene in New York City as German prisoners were boarding trains to be taken into different parts of the United States. Stan Glover, are you still in here? Okay, he had to leave for a minute. Jeff, do you recognize that gateway there? You've seen it before. That's on Highway 61, over near your home, where you grew up, near Lepanto in that area. Well, that's Stan, but where did you grow up? Not far from there. That's good enough. This is actually still standing today here in Arkansas. Over on Highway 61, if you kind of parallels 55 that goes up to St. Louis. It's on the Delta region over there. It was Camp Dermont here in Arkansas where German prisoners were held. This is scenes of some of the barracks from those days. Plaque out front telling you about the prisoners that were held there. Anyone want to take a guess what they did here in Arkansas? The land of opportunity, the natural state. What did they do? Cotton. German prisoners working in cotton fields here in Arkansas. Can you imagine? This was at Camp Robinson. Those are actually German prisoners. Don't they look young? Camp Robinson is only 45 miles from here. It was one of the model POW camps during the war. And it really caused problems with local folks. The local folks around Little Rock, Arkansas, different areas, had food rationed. They couldn't buy cigarettes. They were rationed, and yet they were provided German prisoners. So the locals really did not like that very much, that they were being rationed while prisoners were getting things they couldn't. And then those who had lost loved ones in the war. The German prisoners in Arkansas were not very welcomed. And yet some of them became friends with those with whom they worked. This is a letter. Can you read it? I couldn't either. I had to blow it up to see the print. Still had to just detail. This was from a German POW. Decker was his name. He served on a farm here in Arkansas, and he wrote this letter back to the landowner. I wonder, though, for these men who were here, whether it be Camp Chaffee or those who died on American soil. This is one of the saddest pictures to me. This was at Camp Robinson, where 4 German soldiers were buried. What would it have been like to be a prisoner of war on foreign soil? What kind of feelings would be in your mind? I think loneliness, possibly despair, a lot of uncertainty. Would I ever get back home? Maybe not. It would be tough. Before I go on, though, I want to read a passage of Scripture because we're going to think about a prisoner tonight. Not a prisoner of war in the natural sense. But let me read this Scripture from the Bible and then we'll go on. This is Paul. He's writing to the church at Rome in Romans chapter 1. He says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit, in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you." Now, what does Paul want to do? "Always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I've planned to come to you and have been prevented to do so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." We have the heart of Paul seen before us right here. He wants to go to Rome. He wants to preach to the Gentiles there. He wants to encourage them. He wants to be encouraged by them. His desire is to go to Rome and to preach. Let's continue with the slides. Paul in Rome. How did Paul finally get to Rome? As a prisoner. He was escorted by soldiers. While in Rome, Paul is not a free man, he is a prisoner. And I want to read a statement to you that Paul wrote. It's in the Philippian letter. We'll have it up on the board. He says, "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else." The Praetorian Guard was a palace guard. They were the elite of all Roman soldiers. He's saying they know of my imprisonment. They know the reason. He's preaching the gospel in Rome. But he goes on to say, "And that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear." In this statement, he says, because of my circumstances. We could easily conclude that the circumstances that he was under were not the best. He was a prisoner. They're probably not the circumstances in which he wanted to go to Rome. He desired to go to Rome and to preach the gospel in Rome. But I doubt that he envisioned that as going there as a prisoner. And yet he says, my circumstances here have been good for the gospel, the progress of the gospel. I want this evening for us to think about circumstances. I entitled the lesson, "My Circumstances." What do people gain from my circumstances? What do I gain from my circumstances? How do my circumstances change, and what comes of it? Let's look just for a few minutes at some of the different circumstances of Bible characters we can find. The first one is Esther. Put up here, this is a positive circumstance. Esther, a Jewish captive in the Medo-Persian Empire. Ahasuerus is the king. We know the story of how she becomes queen of this nation under the bride of King Ahasuerus. We'd say that's a positive thing. But if you remember the story, Haman, the king's servant, has developed a strategy, a plan to do away with the Jewish people. And Mordecai, her uncle, Esther's uncle, comes to her and he makes this statement to her. He says, you know, if the king destroys the Jewish people, that's going to mean you too. And you need to step up. You need to take a stand here and let the king know what's happening. He makes a statement to her, one very familiar statement. He says, who knows that you have obtained royalty for such a time as this? So her circumstance as a captive has changed to royalty, very positive. And he says, you're here for a reason. Mordecai tells her, you're here for a reason. And we know that she does work through this with King Ahasuerus and saves her people, the Jewish people. This morning, Casey brought us the story of Joseph. His circumstances were very negative. We know it turned out for good. And we saw this morning God's presence with him throughout this time. But for 13 years, from the time he was 17 to the time he was 30, he was punished. He was beaten. He was rejected by his brothers. He was deceived. He was lied to. He spent years in prison. 13 years. What did he do with those circumstances? Well, Casey revealed to us this morning the great outcome that came because of his awareness of God. Let's look at another circumstance. Paul. The reason I wanted to use Paul tonight is because some circumstances are beyond my control. How about it? When you think about your circumstances, do you have control of all of them? None of us do, of all of them. Some circumstances in life are beyond our control. The one that came to my mind concerning Paul was his thorn in the flesh, and we don't know what it is. But we know he pleaded with God 3 times to remove it. God chose not to. God told him, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength comes through weaknesses. My power is made strong through weaknesses. Paul implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave him. It was not something he could control. And yet, it was there. My grace is sufficient for you. Power made perfect in weakness. That's a tough one to swallow, isn't it? It's a tough one. Things that are not under our control. In contrast, we have some circumstances that are self-imposed. David chose to commit sin with Bathsheba. David chose to have Uriah put to death. David chose to deceive the people. When Nathan came to him and told him the story of the rich man taking the poor man's lamb when he had a guest, and the poor man just loving that lamb, you know what I thought of when I read that story? Some of y'all's pets. In that story, it says that the poor man fed that lamb from his table and let that lamb drink from his cup. He'd hold that lamb on his lap. I mean, Nathan is driving home an important point here, that lamb was everything to that poor man. He said, the rich man took it and gave to his guest. And David was so angry, David said, that man ought to be put to death. And Nathan said, you are the man. You know, sometimes we bring on circumstances of our own will, and they're tough, and sometimes we don't see them for what they really are. But David was dealing with some things in his life that he brought on himself. A couple of more circumstances. Jesus, and on this one, I just put great up there. I can't think of a circumstance more intense or threatening or hard to deal with than Jesus' weekend of his crucifixion. As he's in the garden and he prays to God, says, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. He had been rejected by his friends. He was about to be just totally physically beaten, spat upon, nailed to a cross. I don't think we could find a greater circumstance in life for someone to deal with than that one that Jesus had to deal with the weekend of his crucifixion. In contrast, I put a small circumstance up there. This one seems really small to me, but I'm not washing the dishes. Martha says, my sister had left me to do all the serving alone. You remember when Jesus went to their house? And Mary's listening to Jesus, and Martha's over here, and she says, this is not fair. I'm having to do all the work. Well, we know Jesus said, well, Mary's chosen the better. And that's kind of the story we get out of that. But tonight I would like to think about the circumstances here. Think about it. Seems like not a big deal that Mary is not helping. But it's a big deal to Martha. And she's concerned about all of the food, the preparation. That's what Martha's concerned about. But it made me think how that in life, some of the small circumstances can really be a big deal. When Jesus told the parable of the great feast, and the invitation that was sent out for people to come, you remember the responses? I bought a piece of land. I bought 5 oxen. I just got married. Speaking of circumstances. We're dealing with one. When you think about the excuses given to Jesus, or given to that master who invited people to his table, they were things like, I bought land, I bought cattle, I've got something going on, excuses. And so, with that, it made me think, in life, what really keeps us from serving God the way that we ought to? I think it's probably a lot of times the small circumstances. The business of life. When Jesus taught the parable of the sower and the seed, you remember the seed that grew up and yet the thorns grew up around it? He says it choked it out, and it was the burdens of life. Things that we might consider the small things. Well, let's go on. My circumstances vary from day to day and moment to moment. Would you say that's true with your circumstances? I mean, they're ever changing. Mine differ from yours, yet at times may be the same. True or false? I think that's true. You know, we have, in our prayers this week, we have 4 or 5 families that are all dealing with the circumstance of loss of a loved one. That may not be your circumstance this week. but sometimes it may be a case that you're dealing with the same circumstances others are around you. Sometimes circumstances are just too heavy to bear. Other circumstances are too wonderful to describe. I don't know if Scott is here tonight, Scott Ragsdale, but I remember coming up to him on a Sunday morning after Brooke, his first child, was born. I said, "Congratulations, Scott." And he looked at me, you know how Scott is. He looked at me and just shook his head, and he said, "I believe that I've witnessed a miracle." He went with his wife to birth of their first child. He said, "I believe I've witnessed a modern-day miracle." Well, circumstances are just too hard to describe sometimes. They're so great. They may be, sometimes they cause us to cry out, why? Why? And through personal choices, other times we know exactly why. You know, when Nathan talked to David, and it was presented to him, and he said, "You're the man." David knew exactly why the circumstances were the way they were. He may not have liked it, but he knew. Point tonight is this. Paul had made the statement as a prisoner. He says, "My circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel." Point is, God can be glorified in all circumstances. Is God glorified through my responses to the circumstances I face in life? One thing I think we should remember is this, that my circumstances aren't exclusive to me. Others are watching. The Praetorian Guard knew. The believers had more trust and faith and assurance by what they saw in Paul in Rome. And it's true today. People watch you. They watch me. They know I'm a Christian. They know you're a Christian. When you face different circumstances in life, what are they finding out about you? Is God glorified through the circumstances that you face in life? Think about this. When it's the negative circumstances that we're facing, we think that that's when people are watching. What are they learning from the negative circumstances I'm facing? And you know, often we want God to remove those circumstances from our life. True? I mean, who likes sickness? Who likes debt? Who likes accidents? Who likes it? We don't. And so our prayers are full of, "God, would you please heal this person? God, would you please do this for us?" Removing the negative circumstance from our life. We want it gone. We're interested in changing the circumstance. But you know, I think it's true as you look at Paul, that God was interested in changing the person more than the circumstance. God was interested in shaping Paul to depend on him, speaking of God, not Paul himself. My grace is sufficient for you. I think the challenge we have tonight is this. I think probably we're all on track when we say it is the difficult circumstances that often push us toward faith and trust in God. You know, whether it's an individual, a country, a church, when difficult things come up, that's when we go to prayer. That's when we want to trust God. I think the challenge for us, most of us, is this. It is the good circumstances that can create a tendency to forget God. It's when all of our circumstances are good that we tend to forget God. Paul also made this statement in this same letter. He said, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I underlined, I have learned the secret. I have not. This is Paul speaking. He says, I have learned the secret of how to deal with every circumstance, whether good, bad, rich, poor. I have learned the secret. I don't think we're born with that, do you? I think as we go through life, we are molded by things that we experience. And we either turn toward God or we turn away from God. And it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad circumstances. It's the bad ones that tend to force us into that faith and trust mode in God. And maybe the times of richness and health and prosperity is the bigger threat because we forget God. But Paul says, I've learned in either case the secret. Well, what is it, Paul? One of the most familiar verses in this text. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Could we read that together as we close tonight? Why don't we read that together? I can do all things through him who strengthens me. As I mentioned a while ago, it's easier to quote it and say it than it is to live it. But I think as we go through those experiences, those circumstances in life, that's where we learn it. We learn the secret to put our confidence and trust in Jesus Christ and not ourselves. There's one thing that I hope will come from all of our circumstances, and that's seen in the statement of Paul. As he wrote about his imprisonment in Rome, he says, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. This life is really not about you and me. It's not about Paul. It's about God and how God lives within our lives and how he influences our thinking and the victory that he gives us through his Son. Circumstances are different, aren't they? And we all have different ones that we're facing. And we are all children of God who need to glorify God in those situations, whether it be good or bad. I just hope as Christians that we can see how that God has blessed us so richly with so many good things. And we should use those to his glory. When we take that and go off and do our own thing in life, and it becomes a life centered around James Anderson and not God, I'm far off base. My life needs to glorify God in every circumstance. Well, as a history person, when I see those pictures of those stone entrances to the prison camp, my mind goes back to, boy, I wonder what it would have been like for a German all the way across the sea to be in Arkansas, in the Delta region, picking cotton. I wonder where my mind would go. But I also think that about Paul when you think about him in Rome and think of all the negative things he could think about of his situation. And yet, he desired to go to Rome to preach. He did not go there the way he wanted to, but he continued to preach, and God was glorified. May that be what happens in our lives as well. This evening, the invitation song has been selected. If we can be of help to you in prayer, if there's someone who would like to give their life to Jesus Christ this evening, we'd love to help you. Come as we stand and sing.